Welcome to Soul Care, a time to remember what we cherish. During this COVID-19 pandemic, we are experiencing many kinds of losses. The loss of freedom, the loss of our health, the loss of our income in some cases, the loss of time with people we love to be together with, and for many, the loss of lives dear to us. We yearn to have things back the way they were. We remember the time when life was very different. We could go places, we could see people, but we really can't go back. We feel very alone now, but we can't just turn the clock back. And yet we can remember. Loss requires grief work. I'd like to talk about some different kinds of grief, some different kinds of loss today. I attended a workshop led by a chaplain at a hospital in San Jose named John Visitation, and he described different kinds of losses. One is just material loss, which is pretty concrete. Your friends comes down in a storm and you don't have it and you have to replace it. That's a loss. It's a hassle, and it might be a costly hassle. It could be a problem in a time when money is tight, and it causes stress. You might have to pick a different kind of wood or a different style, and it might not be the one you had liked as well as the one before. The material loss might also be sentimental, like your favorite car is wrecked and you had saved up for that car and it was just what you wanted. You loved it. Or you lose your diamond ring, and that has so much more value than its monetary worth. It represents a relationship and you mourn its loss. That's material loss. Of course, the kind of loss that we often think of when we talk about losses, the most serious perhaps, is relationship loss. The loss by death, but it could also be by a breakup or divorce. We have so many memories of the relationship and so many emotions attached. The kind of loss like this takes years to get over. A third kind of loss is something we might not think of right away. It's an intrapsychic loss, like the loss of a dream, a hope. Maybe you always thought you would go to college, but it just never happened. Or you thought you would have children or grandchildren, and you didn't. It's hard to make the adjustment when you wish something had been very different. It's hard to accept the loss. A fourth kind of loss is a functional loss. It comes to all of us after an injury or as we age. When you break your arm, you might not be able to drive for a while. You can't dress yourself. You can't sleep well. And then as we age, we lose our functions little by little, and they don't come back. We can't see as well as we could before. We don't hear well. Perhaps we don't walk well anymore, or we don't remember well. Even though we understand why we have the loss, it's still difficult. We regret it. Another kind of loss is a role loss. That causes difficulty because you've gone through a major transition, like a job change or retirement. And now you're no longer in that role you were in before, that role that gave you status and authority, and you were used to it. It was comfortable. Who are you now? It's less clear. Now that I'm not working anymore, who am I? Or now that I'm divorced, who am I as a single adult? I only knew who I was when I was married. And finally, the sixth kind of loss is a systematic loss, when you have more than one of these losses that happen to you at the same time. Like your spouse dies and you retire. You are both alone and without a clear definition of what to do with your life. Or you have a material loss of your home, for example, after a terrible wildfire, and you lose your house and you have to move. And then you have another kind of an adjustment when you move in with an extended family and your role is unclear as to who does what in that new family situation. And then on top of it all, you have a test and learn that you have cancer. What a new adjustment upon adjustment upon adjustment you have to make. You have compounded losses. Loss of dreams, loss of familiar ways of relating, loss of the future as you had imagined it. All these losses are really very normal, as they require grieving. We have to face them. People grieve in different ways. I don't think there's one right way to grieve, but grieve we must. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross is a famous name. She was famous for her stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and then finally acceptance. People can repeat these stages and they don't always go in order from beginning to end. Sometimes people have to live at one stage a long time, or they might skip a stage or repeat one. Some people move to the acceptance stage after a year or two. For example, after the death of a loved one, if they have ways to express their grief during that time. It helps to have professionals and friends to talk to. When my son Eric died, I was so fortunate to have friends who were counselors and ministers. I talked to these people and I was lucky to have them around me to help me process my grief. My family members, though, grieved in different ways, and in some cases the grief came much later. Perhaps more helpful than these stages by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, because these are also stages of death and dying. Perhaps more helpful are tasks of mourning, as listed by an author by the name of William Worden, W-O-R-D-E-N, Worden. These are 4 stages, and I think they are true. The first is accepting the reality of the loss. The second is working through the pain of grief. The third is adjusting to the new environment. And finally, fourth is finding a connection between the loss and new life. These are the stages of adjusting in the process of mourning that everybody goes through, but they go through them at different rates. For me, after Eric died, I accepted the loss right away. Sure, there were moments when I thought I would imagine him walking in the door, but those were just tiny moments. Basically, he was gone, and I knew that. And I began working through the pain of grief by crying every day, many times, not sleeping well. I wanted to be alone, and I wanted to be in church a lot. I could honestly say that I was acquainted with grief. It had almost become like a friend. I didn't know how I would manage without it. I began adjusting to a new situation as I tried to help my other children handle their grief. And I continued my work as a teacher because it was good for me to keep going. Then I had a call to ministry. Really, it happened in a moment. I had been reading books on death and dying because reading is how I deal with a lot of things in life. And so I had been going to the library every week, getting books and taking them back. And one time as I was taking my books back from my car across the grass at the library, I looked at the grass and I noticed for the first time in months that the grass was green, bright green. My life had had no color in it since Eric had died. I was living in a deep fog, but suddenly color became alive to me that day. I got some new books out of the library, books on the same topics as before, somber topics. And I went home and I began reading one of the books, sitting where I'm sitting here now on this sofa in the family room. The sun was coming into the window behind me on a warm afternoon. And I was reading in this book by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, not her famous book on death and dying, but another book about chaplaincy in a hospital. And I came to the chapter about how a chaplain can help a family face the death of a dying child. And I looked up and I suddenly thought, I could be that chaplain. And then very quickly I thought, I could go to seminary. I could become a minister. It was an immediate moment when things shifted in my thinking, and I had a future that was exciting and new and hopeful. And I told my family and closest friends, and gradually became to understand it as a calling, a call from God to move beyond my grief into a new life. Well, I finished that year of teaching and then one more year putting away all of my lesson plans for the next teacher while I applied for seminary and began to make plans to become a graduate student again at the age of 53. It was like a green light for me. I continued my grief work through this period, the emotional part, as well as the intellectual part of reading and talking to people. And then I started seminary. I was commuting into Berkeley full-time for graduate study, and that's when I put my goals, my life orientation into action. Some psychologists say that this kind of grief work takes plus or minus 7 years. Most people don't try to name a number because it varies so. But I'm sure it takes years to get over a deep grief. My grief work was perhaps helped along because Eric's death was one day before 9/11. One day. And after 9/11, the whole country was in grief, in shock, in grief, and then in the process of deep healing. And we're still in that. Nearly 20 years later, we're still processing what happened on September 11th, 2001. After some of the initial stages of grief following a loss, we begin to remember again. And not only with sadness and tears, but we begin to remember the good things. We remember the joys. We have to remember and grieve in order to move on. Psalm 137 tells of weeping on the shores of the river at Babylon, where the people in exile mourned the loss of their home country, Jerusalem or Zion. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, and there we wept when we remembered Zion. On the willows there we hung up our harps, for there our captors asked us for songs, and our tormentors asked for mirth, saying, "Sing us one of the songs of Zion." How could we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. Let my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth if I do not remember you, if I do not set Jerusalem above my highest joy. The psalmist says that if he forgets Jerusalem, his hand will wither. He won't be able to play the lyre with his hand anymore. And his tongue will cling to the roof of his mouth, and he will not be able to sing anymore. He concludes that he must keep the joy of his memory in his heart. And yes, he must weep. May you remember your losses and mourn them. And then may you find new connections and new ways to integrate your losses into new life. As a society, we will be figuring out how to do this together as we get the vaccine and then finally come out of our sheltering in place mode. May we learn to make the adjustments even while we grieve our losses. And all the while, may it be well with our souls.